In this video, I'll go over why, in my opinion, everyone doing HEMA should learn to cut. In addition to that, I'll be going over how to train cutting and body mechanics. More specifically, I'll be going over training tools, basic training principles, and specific training methods. I will not go into detail for specific exercises for a specific weapon. For that, please go see my cutting series. The link is in the description. In my opinion, everyone doing HEMA with a cut and thrust weapon should learn to cut. But the important question is, why? If you are training to compete in tournaments which don't have cutting, why would you bother? Or if you are doing HEMA because it's fun, why should you concentrate on something which you don't find interesting? The most important reason is that good cutting technique is the same as good body mechanics. And good body mechanics prevent injuries. If you are doing HEMA for the fun of it, of course you don't want any nagging injuries. For example, a tennis elbow. If you want to compete, not getting injured should be pretty high on your priority list. In general, not getting injured should be pretty much the first thing on everyone's priority list. If you are using a cut and thrust sword, you are swinging around a relatively heavy object at relatively high speeds. Wrists and elbows are rather prone to injuries from repetitive motions. Everyone should understand the importance of core support in protecting your spine when doing martial arts. And the list just goes on and on. Now, don't panic about getting injured if you are doing HEMA and you are not doing everything perfectly. It does not mean that you are going to get badly injured. However, the thing is, the longer and harder you do any martial art, the more and more likely it gets that you will get injured eventually. By using proper body mechanics, you will considerably lower the likelihood of an injury. And in the case of an injury, hopefully lower its severity. When using proper body mechanics, you can perform at a higher level even when using a blunt training tool. With good structure, you are able to cut through weak parries. With proper mechanics, it is easier to maneuver the sword around. In other words, you need less strength to do things. More accurately, you are actually using larger and stronger muscles. Those being your core, back and leg muscles instead of your arm or shoulder muscles. Because of this, you also tire slower. It should be obvious that all of these things are beneficial whether you are a hobbyist or a serious competitor. Historical European martial arts are a martial art by definition, or at least trying to be. As most swords are cut and thrust weapons, you should be able to cut with them. For cutting to have anything martial in it, it is not enough to just hit your target. You need to be able to cut in and through your target. Even at the best of times, the descriptions in our sources can be cryptic and the images we have are questionable. There can be straight out mistakes, they might require some pre-existing knowledge we don't have, and so on and so on. By understanding body mechanics, interpreting the sources becomes easier. If you are trying to figure out a cut, and even with the best of your efforts you can't make it cut, it is possible that you are interpreting it wrong. Or there might be a mistake in the explanation in the source. If there is an image with a hand position I know will wreck my wrists in the long run, I will opt not to trust the image. I will just presume that the image is incorrect and the sword masters would have known better. This is actually a very important question to ask. What is cutting training? Many might think that cutting tatami or water bottles is cutting training. However, this is incorrect. Cutting media is only a training tool. It is a way to test your cutting in a way which makes it easier to notice your mistakes. This is explained in more detail in the Cutting and Reading Tatami video. The link is in the description. Training itself is using different kinds of training tools and training methods to train specific skills. The most common way is to use a sharp sword to cut air and listen for the sound the sword makes for feedback. It can also be hitting a pebble with a wooden dowel. In some cases, it could even be doing specific strength training exercises. Before we get to the training tools, it is a good time to subscribe and like the video. Swords. Sharp swords, live swords, real swords, whatever you want to call them. They should be your main training tool if possible. Firstly, they generally give the best feedback in the form of a sword wind. Secondly, they are the actual weapon you are training to use. However, not all swords are made equal. And I'm not talking about different types of swords in the sense of long swords, arming swords, mesas, rapiers, and so on. I'm talking about different types of blade geometries, regardless of the type of the sword you are using. From the perspective of cutting training, there are two main things you want from a good sword. Firstly, the sword should make an easily audible sound when swung. This is mainly the result of the thickness of the blade. The thicker the blade, the louder the sound generally is. On the other hand, the thinner the blade is, the quieter the sound tends to be. Thus, a very thin-bladed sword is not usually the best for practice. If possible, it is always best if you can swing the sword around before purchasing it. Secondly, how easy it is to cut with the sword. Once again, this is mostly up to the blade geometry. Thinner and wider blades tend to be easier to cut with. For example, Type 18C longswords tend to be very good at cutting. The thicker and narrower the blade is, the harder it tends to be cut with. A good example for that is a Type 15A longsword, such as the one here. Do note that swords with thin and flexible blades tend to cut very well, but only if you get the edge alignment just right. They tend to punish edge alignment issues by flexing and not cutting at all. Some Type 12 and 13 longswords tend to behave like this. Your training sword should be somewhere in the middle of that. If the sword is too easy to cut with, it will compensate for your mistakes. On the other hand, if the sword is too hard to cut with, it is likely that you will compensate with more strength and maybe form bad habits. Again, it would be best if you could try out the sword before purchasing it, but this is often not possible. In general, the sword you are using should be of a suitable size for you and not too heavy. What this is depends greatly on the type of sword you are using. Long swords and mesas tend to have quite different specs. There is one more thing a sharp sword needs, and a blunt sword should also have: a properly shaped grip. Whether the grip is oval or hexagonal or some other shape, you need to be able to index the blade. This basically means that you need to be able to tell which way the edges are pointing even with your eyes closed. Now, some specific historical cut and thrust swords do have round grips, but in general, a round grip is a very bad idea. This will include both edge-profiled blunt swords and training swords, such as feather swords. With edge-profiled blunts, I refer to swords which look like sharp swords, but have an edge thickness of maybe 1 to 2 millimeters. These can be basically almost as good as sharps. Indeed, a good blunt sword can be better than a bad sharp sword, but this is usually not the case. However, do understand that this might be just because of my exposure to specific training tools and not a general trend. These types of swords tend to be balanced a bit differently when compared to sharp swords and also be a bit heavier because of the extra material in the blade. Also, naturally you can't cut cutting media with them, with the exception of clay. Yes, you can force a blunt edge profiled sword to tatami, but from a training perspective it makes absolutely no sense. However, these are the best swords for cutting clay. These are the best kind of training tool for you if you can't or don't want to own an actual sharp. For example, because of the laws in the country you live in. Of course, if these kinds of blunts are not also illegal. With feathers, I refer to training tools which have a narrow and thick blade with a safety tip of some kind. These kinds of swords are specifically made for sparring. They can be used for cutting practice, but they are far from optimal. The issue with feathers is that they are not especially sensitive to small changes in edge alignment. Especially if you spar with the feather, it is likely that this bends in more ways than one. Feathers with rolled tips also have the issue that the roll might make a very easily audible sword wind at a completely wrong edge alignment, especially if the blade is twisted in an unfortunate direction. With all of that said, if you have a feather and don't have access to a better alternative, it will do just fine. Just know that there are way better alternatives. Wooden dowels are excellent for power generation, drills and pel work. They are relatively cheap, so it's easy to get different lengths and weights. They are not really suitable for technique training as they don't have an edge to align. I will clump all cutting media to this single entry. On this channel I have 2 videos on tatami as cutting medium, their link is in the description. Outside of tatami I have no too limited experience with the other cutting media. However, here is a short list of the most common ones. If I had to choose a single cutting medium, it would be good quality tatami. Tatami is pretty good for almost everything, and it is excellent for basic cutting diagnostics. The biggest issue with tatami is that it's rather expensive. Again, see the links in the description for the tatami videos. Water bottles are a cheap and easy to get cutting medium. They are pretty good for diagnosing edge alignment and tip speed issues. Also, if you have a stepped stand, they can be used for trajectory diagnostics. Clay is another common cutting medium. It is great for follow-through, power generation, trajectory and grip diagnostics. It can also be reused basically indefinitely if it is stored properly. As a good thing, relatively cheap blunt swords can be used for cutting clay. On the other hand, it is a bit destructive on blades, so you shouldn't be cutting clay with your expensive sharps. The fact that clay can be cut using a blunt training tool might make it the perfect cutting medium for you. If you can't get a sharp sword because of legal reasons, or don't want to own because of personal reasons, you can still cut clay using a blunt training sword. This allows for very effective cutting training without ever handling a sharp sword. Textile materials, whether wrapped around another cutting medium or used as a stack of their own. I'm now talking about more or less historically accurate textiles, such as cheap linen you can get from IKEA, that being in the way less historically accurate side of the spectrum. It should be noted that these also test the sharpness of the sword to a great degree. These add an additional challenge with a larger degree of required accuracy and tip velocity. I highly recommend trying to wrap a tatami in a layer or two of cheap linen. This gives you a rather good idea of how good of an protection textile armor actually gives against cuts. Pelts are great for power generation, targeting and grip training. Whether you are using a hanging pel or a standing pel should make no difference. They have both their pros and cons, but they should both work just fine. Filming yourself when doing cutting training is an invaluable tool. You should regularly film yourself doing cutting training and whenever you are actually cutting medium. With a video of yourself, you can try to be your own instructor. A great feature of video is that you can slow it down and pause it, especially if you have high frame rate material to analyze. This makes spotting your mistakes much easier. The best tool you can have is a skilled cutting instructor. If you can find one locally, perfect. If you can attend a seminar, a webinar, or even send videos of your cutting training to them to analyze, great. A good teacher is the best thing you can have. With this YouTube channel and the cutting series, I try my hardest to be the second best thing. Where training tools are the physical objects we use to train, training methods are the ways we use those tools to achieve specific goals. For example, we want to learn to make a basic descending cut. Our tool of choice could be a sharp sword, and our training method could be making the cut in air and listening for the sword wind and making corrections based on that. This section only shortly explains different training methods. For more detailed explanations, please refer to my cutting series on this channel. The link is in the description. I have a small rant coming, so be warned. Especially with cutting, there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of training methods. Whenever you see someone doing a cutting drill or posting a video online, there is always someone going, "But you would never do that in a fight." A good example of this are what some people are calling trick cuts. These are simply more advanced exercises for training specific skills, such as transitions. A famous example of this is the so-called lightning cut. It simply means that you do a descending, ascending, and a descending cut in quick succession. In the German fencing terms, this would mean doing a right Oberhau, a left Unterhau, and a right Oberhau in quick succession. The idea of this exercise is not to learn to do a lightning cut. The idea is to train transitions. Transitions are the movements you need to make between two actions, in this case two cuts, without compromising those two actions. Have you ever seen anyone telling a person at the style doing push-ups that they would never do push-ups in a fight? Or have you ever heard anyone saying that you are not going to do agility ladder drills in a fight? The idea of an exercise is not to learn to do the exercise, the idea is to learn a specific skill. Of course, If you want to learn to do a lightning cut just because you want to learn to do a lightning cut because it's a cool trick, by all means continue doing what you are doing. Even then, other people should not come and shit on your fun just because they think cutting and cutting training is stupid. My point here is that exercises are just that. They are exercises. The idea is to learn a skill using that exercise. The idea is not to bring that exercise to a context of your training. What you are trying to bring to the context of your training, for example a sparring match, is the skill you are trying to learn using that exercise. And that is the end of the rant. So let's get back to the topic. Doing cutting drills in the air and listening for the sword wind should be your most used training method. Sword wind being the sound the sword makes when it moves through air. As mentioned in the training tools section, different blade geometries produce different sounding sword winds. Your sword might make a different sounding sword wind when compared to some other sword. This is not important. You should learn the sound of your sword wind and then use the changes in that as your feedback. Every good training sword should make a clear sound when the edge is aligned properly. Some swords might make a different sound when the edge alignment is good enough and a different sound when it is just perfect. To make any sound at all, you must have enough tip velocity. However, the necessary speed for any sound at all is not usually that high. The faster the sword moves, the louder the sound gets. You can use this to tell which part of your cutting arc has most speed and thus most cutting potential. Where you really need the speed is the part of the cutting arc in which your sword is going to go through the target you are cutting. You should aim to make this sound start as early in the cutting arc as possible and last as far in the cutting arc as possible. This tells you about power generation and follow through. If the sword wind starts later in your arc, it also means that your power generation starts later in the arc. You should aim to be able to accelerate the sword as rapidly as possible. In other words, you want to make the sword wind start as early in the cutting arc as possible. The sooner the sword wind stops in the arc, the sooner you stop generating power. Usually this is because you start to decelerate the sword too early. Your aim is to keep the sword wind audible as far in the cutting arc as possible. This is called follow through. Again, you need to learn to stop the sword rapidly exactly when you want to stop it. If you can make the sword wind start soon and end late, the effective area of your cutting arc will be maximized. Pells are excellent training tools for power generation, grip and follow-through training. You can hit a well-built pel as hard as you want and it will offer feedback in the form of the impact. You should be able to keep a tight grip, a straight trajectory, and keep the edge aligned on impact. You should also continue generating power through the target instead of hitting the target. Pair drills are not a big part of cutting and body mechanics training. They are mostly useful for targeting training on a mobile target. Whereas cutting media was a tool, test cutting is the method. Test cutting is one of the best ways to detect the mistakes you are making. For a more detailed explanation on how to detect and diagnose the mistakes you are making, please watch the cutting and reading tatami video. The link is in the description. Weight training can also be thought as part of cutting training. The stronger you are, the easier it is to maneuver the sword around. The more explosive you are, the better, as you can cut in a smaller space. This is how you integrate your cutting to your fencing. You should cut as you fence, and you should fence as you cut. There should not be two different ways of using a sword. Thus, whenever you are doing technique drills, be it paired or solo, or you are sparring and so on, concentrate on using good body mechanics and effective cutting and thrusting technique. Training principles are the underlying concepts of how to train. They should govern everything you do with a sword. I have two basic principles when it comes to training. Firstly, start simple, add complexity. Secondly, start big, make small. Let me explain. This simply means that you should start with the basics. With everything you train, you should aim to remove as much complexity from the action as you can. Then, when you can make the action in the simpler form, you can start adding the complexity back to the action. The less moving parts there are in an action, the easier it is to tell what went wrong. You should only advance to, more advanced stuff after you can do the basics properly. Let me give you an example. As one of the very basic actions, we want to learn to make a diagonal descending cut with the long edge from both the dominant and the non-dominant sides. With a longsword, it is generally easier to do the cut starting from the dominant side, so we start with that. We start the cut in a guard with our arms extended and above our head. This way, we remove the need to extend our arms during the cut and make sure that we do not start the cut from too low. We do the cut without a step, as once again, that is one moving part removed. We continue removing parts of the movement until we can no longer do so without changing the movement to fundamentally something different. After we can do the cut in the simpler form, we can then proceed to add those removed complexities back to the action. For example, we can start the cut from a guard on the shoulder. At this point, we can also start training the cut from the non-dominant side. After we can do the cut from both sides with some complexity, we can then start doing them as a combination. This adds transitions. We continue adding complexity in this manner until we reach the so-called real-world situation. This would mean that we cut as we fence and that our fencing would be effective with a sharp sword. The whole idea behind this concept is that if you can't do something in perfect conditions, you cannot do it in adverse conditions. If you can't cut a non-resistive tatami mat, how do you think you could cut someone in protective clothing, moving around, attacking you and doing their best to defend themselves? This idea I have taken directly from Michael Edelson's book Cutting with the Medieval Longsword. And if I remember correctly, he attributes it originally to Sang-Woo Kim, though I might misremember that. The idea is simply that cutting with bigger motions is easier. This is because you have more time to accelerate the sword before contact, and you have more time to decelerate it afterwards. This doesn't mean you should make overly large motions or add movements which do not belong. Let's use the descending diagonal cut from the dominant side as an example once more. You start the cut with your arm straight and over your head, and you cut all the way down until the point of the sword points to the ground. This is the longest cutting arc you can get without adding unnecessary motions. Swinging the sword at the end of the cut so that the point points backwards is unnecessary in the case of a longsword. However, it might be necessary for some single-handed swords. Dropping the blade down behind you at the start of the cut is unnecessary, as you would have to fight the gravity to get it back up. This full cutting arc without extra motion should be your starting point. Only after you can consistently cut with the full cutting arc should you start to make it smaller. Either starting closer to the target, for example simulating a parry before the cut, or stopping the cut sooner, for example keeping the point in line so that it would threaten your target in case you missed. And when you can do both of these properly, you can start combining them so that you start closer to the target and stop the cut sooner. It is naturally more difficult to accelerate the sword with a shorter wind-up distance and decelerate it within a shorter distance. This basic principle ties to the first one in the sense that both aim to make the cut as easy as possible in the beginning. Here are some good guidelines to training, and not just training cutting, but training in general. We are not trying to build stamina here, we are trying to instill correct movement patterns to muscle memory. If you keep training when you are tired, it is more likely that you will be making mistakes. If you then keep making these mistakes, you might instill those incorrect movement patterns to your muscle memory. And rewriting muscle memory is a pain. Also, if your supporting muscles in your arms and shoulders get tired, it is more likely that you get injured. This is especially true with cutting, as it is very likely that your arms tire before your core. Your core generates power, and your arms protect your elbows and wrists. Do note that I do not include sparring in this, as in my opinion, being able to fight while extremely tired is a very important skill to have. Your aim is not to train until you can do what you are training correctly. Your aim is to train until you cannot do it incorrectly. Of course, you will fail every now and then, but it should be the exception, not the rule. Take a break and think about what you are doing wrong. If you keep training, you will be instilling the incorrect execution to muscle memory. If your cuts scoop because you pull with your non-dominant shoulder and you fix it by leaning the other way, you have a major problem. Now you are once again learning incorrect execution, and it is a certainty that it will be a big problem down the road. Always figure out the cause and then fix that. There is a saying, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. But that is complete bullshit. Here is an example. You are going to execute a completely vertical descending cut, and you will be doing it in 3 different ways. If you just let the gravity do its thing, you are not using any muscles beside for gripping the sword and standing. If you want to go any slower, you have to use your shoulder and upper back muscles to slow the sword down. If you want to go any faster, you need to use your lats to speed the cut up. It should be obvious that in these 3 different cases, you are using completely different muscles for the same action. Thus, slow is not fast, it is a completely different thing. You should be in control of every movement you make. If you can only generate core rotation by stepping, what will you do if you can't step? What if you can only generate core rotation starting from your hip and you need to take a passing step with your right leg while cutting from left to right? If you train from the beginning to make every movement intentional, you don't need to train for these kinds of special situations. You already know how to make the necessary movements for the specific situation you are in. Especially in the beginning, this will make your training look stiff and robotic. But as already said, start simple, add complexity, and at some point you will be reaching the real life situation. Before we start the recap, go and subscribe if you haven't and remember to like this video. Also, click the bell icon so you get notified when quality content like this comes online. You should train cutting and body mechanics as it will help you prevent injuries. It will also bring you closer to the martial aspect of HEMA. It will also help you interpret the sources. When training, a historically accurate sharp sword is the best possible tool. However, if you only have a blunt training tool or a feather, they will do just fine. In a pinch, even a synthetic longsword will do. To train, you don't need to cut cutting media. Your main method of training should be doing cutting exercises in the air and listening for the sword wind for feedback. Out of all the cutting media I'm aware, tatami is the most versatile tool. However, be aware of what kind of tatami you are buying. When training, start simple and add complexity, and start big, make small. This means that you should start with the basics and then reduce those basics to their core. Only move to more advanced exercises after you can do these basics properly. Larger cuts are easier to do because you have more time to accelerate and decelerate your sword. Only move to smaller movement patterns after you can do these large cuts comfortably. Don't train until you succeed. Train until you can't fail.